Hello, this is a fourth lecture in a series of 10 which introduce you to economics, micro and then macro. Lecture 1 was just an introduction to economics and explained to you the influence of politics and economics together. The second and third lectures were about markets. In the first lecture I explained that, in my opinion, around 90% of the products are probably better distributed, allocated through marketplaces rather than through a third party or some form of government intervention. And for that reason, the second lecture was about the market, with a preference to explaining the demand side of the market. The third lecture was about the supply side of the market, theories of the firm, where we looked at the firms and the industries that make up the supply side of the market. And this fourth lecture is about markets failing. So it's market failure and market imperfections. Now, I use these two words quite precisely and differently. Quite a lot of economists refer to anything which is an imperfection in the marketplace as a market failure. I don't. As far as I'm concerned, market failure is when markets fail completely to allocate resources. So in other words, there is no market for these resources. That is market failure as far as I'm concerned. Market imperfections are where markets work, where markets allocate resources, but there are imperfections in those markets. So it's important to separate failure, the market doesn't work, to it's imperfect, it doesn't work in a perfect sense, and there we have different issues that we need to deal with. Now, things don't work efficiently in markets, so I'm not one who thinks that markets are ever perfect. In economic terms, there's a perfect market has Pareto efficiency, named after the Professor Alfredo Pareto, a Spanish economist, where the consumers are all acting rationally, aiming to maximise their total utility and equate the marginal utility of the last unit of money spent on each product. And on the supply side, firms are productively efficient and allocatively efficient, and all of these efficiencies go together. And they create a sentence which is easy to remember for Pareto efficiency. It's when you can't make or you can't produce one more good without producing less of something else. If you're Pareto inefficient, you can always reallocate resources and produce more. But if you are Pareto efficient, once you're at that point, the only way you can produce one more thing of something is to produce less of something else. So that's what Pareto efficiency is in terms of words. Now, market imperfections, there are some that can be corrected and there are some that can't be corrected. And one of the things we must bear in mind is that when we're looking at market imperfections and their corrections would usually have to take place through some third party, which is government. And there has been, I suppose, in the past a feeling that government are always perfect in everything that they do, and therefore if they intervene in a marketplace, then they can only improve it because they're perfect. But we know better than that, don't we? Markets are imperfect, governments are imperfect, and indeed governments can fail to do things in the same way that markets can. So when we measure market failures, market imperfections, and we think of the alternative, we also have to remember that the alternative intervention has its imperfections as well, and we must never forget that particular aspect of it. So as I say, all markets are imperfect and some markets actually fail. The real world doesn't live up to the economist's definition of a perfect market. And when I said this was a theoretical extreme when we looked at it in the last unit, it doesn't exist. There's no perfect markets out there. They all have imperfections. But I did say that they are still the best way to allocate most resources and to create most products and satisfy consumer demand, in my opinion. So there are degrees of imperfections. Some are very marginal, some are much bigger, and we would have to look at these to consider whether or not intervention is necessary. And of course, I do believe intervention is necessary up to a point. Because I've said all markets are imperfect, does it mean we need to intervene in all markets? Well, yes, I suppose so, in the sense that we do need those rules and regulations in markets to make sure that they allocate resources in a fair, a level playing field way. But perhaps we don't need much more than regulations and rules. We have in the past, of course, had marketplaces that have been taken over, at least the production side has been taken over by government when industries were nationalised. A lot of them have been denationalised, and there's a big debate at the moment about shall we renationalise them, and indeed it does look as though quite a few industries are going to be renationalised as a result of trying to get out of the problem caused by the current pandemic. But we wait and see on all of those things. So these are the sort of questions that we have to ask ourselves and the things that we have to look at when we're looking at markets. Now, in a marketplace, there are private costs and there are private benefits that are reasonably easy to measure, in as much as the private costs of production are everything a producer has to pay to get the product to the market. So they are what, in terms of productive resources, what economists would say they've got to pay for their raw materials, that's the factory production land, they've got to pay for labour, they've got to pay for capital. If they are borrowing money, they've got interest charges, and they've got to make a reward for themselves, which is the cost of enterprise. So all of these things can be measured. We can put numbers against all of them, nice and easy. Private benefits, again, reasonably easy to identify, because you can say if people are willing to part with money to buy these things, the amount of money that a firm receives illustrates the value of the private benefits that people felt from consuming these products. So private costs and private benefits are nice and easy to identify. But we know that there are external costs and benefits, both in terms of production and consumption, which we need to look at and take into account, because these could be significant and lead us into a situation where we think that some form of intervention should take place. So external costs, relatively easy to identify. If a firm is producing something and it's discharging waste into a local river, or it's discharging pollution into the air, then it's creating a cost to society which it doesn't pay for, and that cost to society is something that is quite easy to identify and describe as a market imperfection. At the point of consumption, there can be external costs. When people smoke cigarettes, they could have injured other people through passive smoking, which is why rules were introduced to say no smoking here, no smoking there. So there are costs, again, involved in people smoking. There are costs involved in people driving cars, exhaust fumes, etc. So these are all costs to society of a marketplace working, and we need to consider them and take them into account when we're deciding about actions. Equally, there are benefits. Firms could offer, do certain things which actually benefit society rather than impose costs upon society, and these things are not easy to measure. All the external impacts on society, you can try and value them, but they're not easy to value, and there can be total differences of opinion about whether they are indeed even a cost or a benefit. For example, if a factory pollutes a river, discharges its waste into a river and pollutes the river, you can say that's a cost. It may kill the fish, it may make the river smelly, it may make it no longer a nice river to walk alongside. The fishermen may get a bit annoyed because the fisher stocks are falling. All costs. It could, however, be that the factory is discharging a waste which actually benefits the river. It creates food for fish, and the fish stocks increase, and it could smell not nasty but nice, and you could walk by the river and go, yes, that's a very nice. So it's possible that one person might judge this as pollution and be a cost to society. Others might go, no, that's all right, that's a benefit as far as we're concerned. So very, very difficult things to measure and give precise numbers to. But they're there. Now, theoretically, we can identify these things if we sort of look at a diagram like this, which is just a reference here to external costs. Now, you're used to demand curves sloping downwards from left to right, and in the case of this downward sloping curve, it's actually measuring the marginal private benefits, the amount of money that people are willing to pay as the price of a product goes down. And it's, in this case, in this example, we're going to take a situation where there are no further benefits to society, so the marginal private benefit and the marginal social benefit are the same line. However, we're looking at external costs, and we've got a line here which looks just like a supply function, but it's the marginal private costs of producing something. Now, if you do pollute the atmosphere, pollute a river, create external costs to society that are not paid for, then the marginal social costs will be above the marginal private costs. That vertical distance here doesn't have to be a parallel shift in this particular curve. Here I've drawn it as a parallel shift, and there's a vertical distance, which is the external cost to society of this product. Now, this product would create an equilibrium situation producing quantity 1. But if we could manipulate things, we would actually want society to produce less of this product because it is imposing costs upon society. So where the marginal private benefit cuts the marginal social cost would be an optimum situation for supplying this product. So we will want less of it supplied at a higher price. We'll sort out how you can do that a little bit later on, but that's all external costs are if we want to think of them in the form of that diagram. Now, external benefits, it's slightly different. We're taking here the cost. There are no external costs in this case, so the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost are the same line. But now the marginal private benefits and the marginal social benefits are separated, because in this case this product actually benefits society. Something like education does that. It creates an educated workforce who are more likely to benefit society as well as benefit themselves, so that the marginal social benefit is shifted outwards from the marginal private benefit, and that vertical distance is an external benefit. Here we would actually like more of this product to be supplied into the marketplace, not less of it. So the marketplace would again equate marginal private cost with marginal private benefit, but we would be better off if we could create an equilibrium between marginal social benefit and marginal private cost. So that's all our externalities are, and we're going to try and juggle around with these and see if there are ways to improve the situation here. So if, I suppose we might as well add this one, if you actually had an industry where there were both benefits and costs, which were external costs and benefits to society that were not paid for at the point of production and consumption, you could find yourself in a situation where there are both marginal social benefits and marginal social costs. And again, it would be the intersection of marginal social benefits and marginal social costs, which would be the ideal equilibrium situation for this product. So there will be a market equilibrium where private costs and benefits intersect, and a beneficial optimum situation for society where social benefits and social costs intersect. So, obviously, the more costs and benefits are external to the production process, in other words, not paid for by the producer or the consumer, the more you would think about intervening. Minor and small amounts, or amounts about which you couldn't decide whether or not they were actually costs or benefits, you probably wouldn't intervene. You just leave that particular situation alone, particularly as it imposes costs when you're trying to deal with these problems. So it might be worth sort of having a rule that we would only ever intervene in these markets that have externalities, costs or benefits, if we can improve the situation, because we have to take into account that we can't always improve the situation because governments may not have the information and may not be able to do anything about it. The third party may not be able to solve these problems. Now, remember at the start I said there are market failures and there are market imperfections. Let's just look at market failures, because we've already identified right at the beginning of the course that there are a number of different economic goods, and at one extreme there's the public good. And the public good is the good that we all want. It's a collective consumption good, but none of us are prepared to buy, and no one's prepared to produce it in a private capacity, because it has these two characteristics of being non-rival and non-excludable. That is, I produce it for one person, I can't stop anyone else free riding. If someone consumes it, they can't stop other people consuming it at the same time. So you wouldn't pay if you know everyone else is consuming it and not paying. So these are the things where the market would fail completely. You cannot have a marketplace for public goods. And these are things like street lighting, some forms of road, internal defence, external defence, law and order. These are all collective consumption goods, and the market would fail to allocate resources to the provision of these public goods. But we want them, don't we? So this might be one very good reason for government to intervene and to provide these non-rival, non-excludable public goods. Now, do we want governments actually to do any more than just demand them on our behalf? How are we going to pay for them? Is it going to be local rates? Is it going to be street lighting? Let's take that as an example. Street lighting are things you will want, but you're not prepared to buy them and put lights up outside your house in the road. As we've said before, you might put them at the front door of your house, but you won't put them out in the road because you can't exclude other people from benefiting or sharing the cost of installing and running these things. So do you then say, let's have a collection in the road and we'll all put up street lights so you could finance it road by road, or do you say no because other people are going to come and use these roads from outside this road and outside this area? Do you want it financed locally, or is it something that would have to be financed nationally? We said law and order. If the law is a public good, is enforcing the law a public good or a private good? You can have a police force, can't you? A police force will protect you and enforce the law. But suppose you had a game of football and you wanted some police to separate the crowds and make sure there's no violence at the ground. If you want to buy police under those circumstances or security under those circumstances, is that a public good? Or is it just a cost to the football club to hire these security guards? So it's not easy, once again, to quite separate what's a public good and what's not a public good. And we do have one characteristic of what's called a quasi-public good, where something has all the characteristics of a public good, but it need not necessarily be like that. For example, a beach could be a public good. Anyone could use it, and it's there as a gift of nature. Or it could be a hotel. We'll put a fence around it and turn it into a private good, and you can only use it if you're in the hotel or if you pay to go onto this beach. So again, you can see there's not clear separations between all the terms that I'm going to use. Armies, navies, air force, we may need to have those both demanded and supplied privately, although all the things that these forces may use need not necessarily be supplied by the government. They could be supplied or purchased by private companies. So the demand for a pure public good is collective, no individual consumer demand, so we like a third party to deal with that, to buy this thing. We don't necessarily need a government to supply these things. It will probably be difficult to think in terms of a private army, although there are mercenaries, so there are private soldiers and people who would act privately on behalf of protection. Lighthouses, they're very much a public good, but you could have those run privately. It might be very nice, mightn't it, to live in a lighthouse and just make sure the lights are working all right and make sure everything's switched on at the right time or switched off or whatever it may be. We've got private prisons, we've got private suppliers of street lighting, legal services, waste collection. These sort of things come into the area of public goods where they're demanded collectively, but they need not necessarily be supplied by this third party or government. You could have private supply of these products which are technically demanded as a public good. So these are market failures. Now there are, of course, many products which come into the category or are described as merit goods. Now these are goods which would be under-consumed in the marketplace, and if they are significantly under-consumed in the marketplace, there's a good argument to say, can we increase the consumption of these products because they benefit society? And they're still private goods. These are not non-rival, non-excludable goods. They're rival and excludable goods. So they're private goods, but they're under-consumed and therefore underproduced if you charge a market price for these. The two big examples that you would include here are education and health. As we know, a healthy, educated workforce is much better for society than not healthy and not well educated. We also know that the distribution of people's ability to benefit from education doesn't correspond to the distribution of income required to pay for that education. So it means that there might be some very intelligent people out there who could benefit society if they could develop their education to a high level, but they can't afford to do it. So there are reasons for supporting thinking about intervening in these particular markets to try and encourage consumption and increase production because of the significant benefits of these products. So if we just looked at education for a moment, we can look at health after that, but if we looked at education, should we offer a state educational system which is free at the point of consumption? Should it be a lifetime thing that everyone can have education whenever they like at no cost? Or should it be that just some education is available for people, shall we say, between the ages of 5 and 18, and we could offer education that's free for that period of time. We could, and certainly this sort of things have been talked about, we could offer vouchers to people and say, right, you're entitled to 13 years of education. So you can have 13 vouchers which will pay for your education for 13 years, and you might say you've got to use 11 of them, so you've got to be educated between 5 and 16, but you could save 2 of them. You could keep back 2, and you might want to do your A-level education when you're in your 20s, 30s, 50s. You might even want to do it when you retire. So you could have a voucher system that allocates resources to education in a way that would increase its consumption, because remember, if you offer a product free, then people will consume it right up to the point at which they will get no additional utility from it if they want to maximise their utility under these circumstances. You then need to look at issues about, should you make education something that's selective or not? Should you have grammar schools, secondary modern schools, technical colleges, and should you qualify to have one type of education or another? These are all interesting things. I'll have a little bit more to say in a moment about that, because I do have some views here that I would like to express, but we'll say a little bit more about it in a minute. Let's look at health. Should we have a national health service? Lots of arguments against it, lots of arguments for it. Lots of countries that don't have health systems that are free. Should we have a health system that's free? Should we have a health system that's free, or one that's offered at a subsidised price? That is, it's cheaper than it would cost in a marketplace, but it's not free. And again, that's particularly interesting, bearing in mind the last point that we said, that if you offer something free, people will consume it right up to the point at which they get just a little bit of additional utility. GP practices, for example, have often over the years complained that they're full of people who really don't need to be there, because if it's free, you wake up in the morning with a rash, or you wake up in the morning not feeling particularly well, I'll go to the doctors, see what the problem is. The doctor will go, yes, you've got a little bit of a rash, yes, you're not feeling particularly well, all you need to do is do this, and if the problem continues, come back and see me in 7 days' time, or whatever it may be. However, if you subsidise this, if you say, no, you pay when you go to the GP, even a small amount, you can say, every time you go to the GP, it's a £5. £5 will reduce the number of people going to GPs very quickly, and you will get probably a more efficient allocation of resources, in as much as you would know that the people there really need to be there, rather than just taking advantage of a situation that's provided to them, which is totally free. I suppose, let's look at this, because this is quite interesting, particularly with regard to education, much more so than, with regard to health, much more so than education. And that's the sort of shape of the demand function. So if you've got a demand function that's fairly steep, like this, and the marginal cost curve here is an illustration of the supply function, then P1Q1 will be the market price and the market quantity, the equilibrium situation that would clear the market. If I offered this free, the extra amount consumed wouldn't be that much, Q2, as opposed to Q1. Now, every time we offer a product at less than its marginal cost, you'll remember we're not being allocatively efficient. So there's a sort of little triangle there, ABC, that suggests, we'll just call it waste. It's an inefficient use of resources in this situation, but it's very small because of the shape of the demand function. Now suppose the demand function was much more elastic or shallower. So it looked like that. The market price and quantity would be P1, Q1. But here, because the demand curve sort of continues on out a long way before it meets the horizontal axis, there's a lot of consumption of this product where the marginal cost is rising, and the triangle ABC now is large, and this suggests a big or a bigger waste of resources if the demand function for the product looks like that. Now that's quite significant, because in the health service, if you're offering things free, there's a tendency to significantly over-consume. So should we only offer some health services free? You could consider things like emergencies and life-threatening illnesses, contagious diseases, some sorts of physical and mental disabilities. These things should be dealt with free. But you might want to consider other things that you'd have to pay for. These things, cosmetic surgery, you might want to have the nose slightly changed, the eyebrows lifted or changed, or get rid of the double chin, or whatever it may be. Should you pay for that? Should you not expect you shouldn't expect to have that provided free to you? And it gets worse, doesn't it? Self-inflicted conditions. If you play sport and get injured, should that be covered as an emergency? If you enjoy eating and are rather overweight and you have something wrong with you associated with obesity, should you have that dealt with free on the National Health Service? If you're an alcoholic, it's self-inflicted, or is it? So should it be provided free? If you're a smoker, you have lung cancer as a result of smoking, should you have to pay for treatment there? Should you have it free? So you can see there's a lot of big, difficult issues. I'm not making any judgments on these things, but I'm throwing them out there so you just think about those things when you are providing a product which is a private product, but you're thinking it's one that's got considerable external benefits, and therefore we need to encourage an increase in consumption for these things. At the same time, as you have a state educational system, should you allow private schools? Should you allow those to run alongside and people to be able to pay for their children to go to what they might think of as better schools, to give their children a better opportunity than your children, because you can't afford to send them to private schools? Should you have privately run hospitals alongside a state National Health Service where people can go and buy their cosmetic surgery or can jump the queue and get dealt with more quickly than waiting to go into a national health hospital? Should hospitals compete with each other for patients? Should schools compete with each other for students, for customers? Those are all big issues that need to be dealt with. How do you deal with the problem of asymmetric information? Which is, asymmetric information is where one side of a contract has more information than the other side. Now, in terms of schools, you probably are pretty good at finding good schools for your children. If you could choose between them, you'd look them up and sort them out and chat to people and find. But health services are a bit different, because there are doctors who even used to write in Latin, who know much more than you do about health services and health conditions. And that can create a problem, because if you look at countries like America, where the health system is private, there is a suggestion that people get talked into having a lot more things done to them when they go into hospital or when they consider themselves to be unwell than would happen under a national health service, where they would want to deal with the problem but not want to add a few things on and twist your arm into having extra treatments done that were probably not necessary. So supplying merit goods, again, is a bit of a minefield to know exactly how to do these things efficiently. Now, because I've been involved a lot in education all my life, I do have a sort of idea of what my blueprint for education will be. I won't spend too long with you, but let me just suggest this is what I would do. I went to a grammar school when I went to 3 universities. I went and taught in a public school, wanted to see what things were like in a public school. I then went to teach in a state sixth form college and then went back to teaching in university. So I've sort of seen a lot of this, and I'm sure that this is the best system. You see, I would get rid of grammar schools, even though it was great for me. They're not a good way of allocating resources. So my ideal educational system would be a state-funded, free at the point of consumption for 5 to 16-year-olds, and 2 extra vouchers you can use any time in your life in order to have 2 more years of education. And I'd run it alongside private education. You can go private if you want to, but the state education is there for you, and it will be an excellent education. There's no selection at infant level, at primary level, or at secondary schools, so there are no grammar schools or anything of that sort. So all secondary schools are comprehensive. Lots of competition. I don't mind there being top sets and bottom sets and all those sort of things within the school, but flexibility to move from one set to the other as you get better, or indeed as you get worse. So no streaming as far as I'm concerned, and I'd only have 11 to 16 secondary schools, because sixth form colleges are absolutely great. They can offer a full range of courses. They can attract people to work hard, because students, there is a big difference between an 11-year-old and a 17-year-old. 16, nice time to go to a different institution. Sixth form colleges are a little bit like university, but you're still at home, and it makes the step to university much easier if you go through the sixth form college route. And then I'd have undergraduate degrees that you're selected on merit for those, but they're free of fees, and there wouldn't be so many universities and so many courses. And I'd like my 11 to 18 schools run by local authorities, not by the government, and my private system would run alongside that as well. That will be my, rather quickly, my blueprint for education. I have one for health as well. I want a state-funded National Health Service. I'm not into not having that, and it would be lifetime for you, free for essential and emergency types of treatment. I'd have the private health system running alongside it, where you can pay for anything that you want. I'd have hospitals run by a small management team. I don't like the big bureaucracies. I don't like, in education and health, this sort of obsession with measuring the process of what's going on. The bureaucracies are a big waste of time, so I need a small management team, and then lots of doctors and nurses, lots of teachers, because I want them to be run where you look at the outcome of what's going on, not the process of what's going on. If the outcome's good, you never investigate the process. If the outcome's bad, you might investigate the process, but we don't have to investigate all the processes in order to determine whether something is doing well or not. So I'd have my small management team running a hospital, and I actually like the idea of monopsonistic buying of health products. So I would have the whole national system involved in purchasing health products. A monopsony is where it's like a monopoly, where you've got the sole producer. Monopsony is where you've got one buyer, and when you've got one buyer of health products, then you can force down the price of something which is very important, and keep it lower than it would otherwise be in a marketplace. So that's how I would like health organised, but they will be big lectures on their own, but I think I better mention it there. Let me introduce to you, or remind you of, the demerit goods. I mean, these are failures. Sorry, I've used the word failure. These are imperfections. They're not failures, because there are markets there for demerit goods, but they are imperfect because these ones are overconsumed in the marketplace. They are things like alcohol, smoking, gambling, sugar, salt, chocolates. These may or may not be overconsumed in the marketplace, and that causes problems. So you can get cost to society if people are drunk, leave the pub, go out and beat up anyone they can find. If people smoke too much, they get cancerous diseases, and indeed they may pass things on to other people through passive smoking. Gamblers are notoriously obsessive. So if they become notoriously obsessive, then you've got a problem with gambling. We're told, aren't we, that too much sugar is not good for us, or too much salt's not good for us, or too many chocolates are not good for us. These are all the demerit goods, and they're considered to have costs for society which are not paid for by the people who produce these goods or consume these goods. So what should government do? Should it reduce the consumption of these things? Should it ban these things? Should it offer a ration book? You know, you can have a ration book which says you can smoke this number of cigarettes a week, or get access to this number of cigarettes a week, or you can only gamble with this amount of money every week, or you're allowed to have one glass of wine or 1 pint a day over a week, so you could ration things as they used to be after the war. Or something I'll suggest in just a moment to you is you could create a situation where you just leave it to the private sector, but you influence demand through price. So where we talked about getting the price down for merit goods, let's push the price up with some form of indirect taxation on these demerit goods to discourage people from consuming them. Again, let me illustrate that sort of situation to you. Here we've got external costs. So the external costs, delta delta T is written here because it's taxation. If you put an indirect tax on a product which has external costs, you would shift this marginal private cost up to reflect the social cost to society, and in the process you would reduce consumption and raise the price of this product through external costs and a tax on products. You could actually raise the price to an optimum for society and reduce the quantity demanded. And that obviously happens when you think of the indirect taxes that there are on smoking, on alcohol, on gambling, sugar tax, and I'm not sure whether we have to pay any tax on our chocolates yet, but I'm sure someone will think of it soon. So costs, we could eliminate, we could internalise those costs by putting an indirect tax on the product. Where you've got external benefits, of course, it's the other way round. When you've got external benefits, the marginal private benefit is further out than the marginal social benefit. So what you would want to do, a marketplace would produce an equilibrium at P1, Q1, but you'd actually want more to be consumed because these products have external benefits, so you'd want Q2 to be consumed. So how could you do that? You could do that by subsidising this product, which effectively would bring down the marginal private cost to a lower level by subsidising each of these products, and you could end up then with an equilibrium at a lower price, P2, and more consumed Q2. So your external benefits and your external costs could be dealt with by taxation and subsidy. And I suppose even more interesting than that is the fact that you could trade off both of these against each other, couldn't you? Merit goods, we're going to subsidise them. Where are we going to get the money from? We're going to tax demerit goods. So you can sort of shift funds over and do a good deed, discouraging the products where there are damage to society, encourage the products where there are benefits to society, and it could all be done through a marketplace. So again, a significant point of interest. Now, the one thing to say as we sort of round all of this up is that when you have public goods, when you have merit goods, you do need to think about a third party to allocate these resources. And you do have to remember that if government gets involved in these markets, that governments are not perfect and that governments may fail to do things properly. And remember the motives of governments. The motives of governments are not to efficiently allocate resources. The motives of government are to keep, in a democracy, to keep votes, to keep in power. And keeping votes and keeping in power is different from what might allocate resources efficiently. Do governments have the information to be able to do things better than the marketplace? Probably not. The marketplace collates a lot of information as resources are allocated. Can government do that better than the marketplace? You know, are our expert businessmen all happy to turn themselves into politicians, be paid a lot less money and do a much better job than businessmen would do? Probably they can't do that. So there's information failure, if you like, within the government sector. And we must always remember that there's an opportunity cost of government doing anything. Because again, in the past, where there was a feeling that governments would always be perfect when they intervene, there was another feeling that governments can always intervene and do things at no cost. It's all free. If government do it, it's not, of course, because remember, as economists, we know about opportunity cost, don't we? We know that if governments allocate funds to doing this, those funds are not available to do other things. There's an opportunity cost of government intervention. And if governments intervene and improve things in the economy by £1 million, but it costs £2 million to do it, you might say that wasn't particularly a useful way of spending taxpayer money. So when you're looking at market imperfections, market failures, you must remember the costs involved. You must remember the limitations of this third party that might be trying to do things for you, and look very carefully and analyse very carefully what is going on. So we've gone through a number of things, and it sort of leaves you with quite a few questions, I trust, in your mind, because should governments demand all public goods? The answer to that is probably yes. Should governments supply all public goods? The answer to that is probably no. Some they've got to supply, but a lot could be supplied by the private firm, by the private sector. Should individuals be able to demand merit goods free or at a subsidised price? Should we have education free at the point of consumption? Or should you pay a little bit towards education? Should we have health free at the point of consumption? Or should you pay a little bit for particular types of health products? Should merit goods be supplied by government? Or should merit goods be supplied by the private sector? Or a mixture of both? I mean, my ideal is to have private education alongside state education, private health services alongside state education systems, and not one or the other, but a mixture of those sort of things. And a point I made earlier, let's just look at the outcome of all of these things. Let's not waste time by trying to prove that everything is working perfectly. It's working perfectly if the outcomes are good. And the final thing to bear in mind is that we do have an obvious link between merit goods and demerit goods. Let's encourage more consumption of merit goods by subsidising by offering them free, and let us pay for some of it, not all of it, but let's pay for some of it by reducing the demand for demerit goods. So all of that is about markets being imperfect and markets failing. So we've introduced, if you like, microeconomics to you in the sense of marketplaces and how marketplaces work and how marketplaces allocate resources, but we recognise the fact they're not perfect, they're not wonderful, and there are indeed some aspects of these goods which wouldn't be provided in a marketplace at all in the case of the provision of the public good. The next lecture will be the beginning of macroeconomics, and macroeconomics becomes a little bit more controversial with some interesting arguments and counter-arguments that we can look at. So I hope you've enjoyed this one, and I'll be back again with lecture 5 in the not too distant future. Thank you.